Picture this. October 22nd, 2001. The morning sun filters through the towering hedgerows of East Hampton, casting long shadows across manicured lawns worth more than most people's homes. At 59 Middle Lane, behind electronic gates and security cameras, a $8 million mansion sits silent, too silent. Inside, investment banker Mark Angelson paces nervously through marble hallways. He's supposed to meet his business partner, Ted Ammon, but Ted missed their London conference call. Ted never misses calls. Something is wrong. What Angelson discovers in the master bedroom will shatter the illusion of safety that money can buy. Ted Ammon, multimillionaire, Wall Street titan, devoted father, lies naked and motionless, his skull crushed by at least 30 savage blows. But this isn't a random act of violence. This is something far more sinister, a murder orchestrated by love, greed, and betrayal. A crime that will expose the dark underbelly of America's wealthy elite and prove that even in paradise, evil can find a way in. This is the story of how a bitter divorce, a dangerous love affair, and a man's desperate need for money led to one of the most shocking murders in Hampton's history. The making of a millionaire. Robert Theodore Ammon didn't start life with a silver spoon. Born August 30th, 1949, in the Steel City of Pittsburgh, Ted was the son of a pension coordinator and a homemaker who pushed her children to dream bigger than their blue-collar surroundings. From childhood, Ted possessed an almost supernatural ability to excel at everything he touched. Whether it was academics, sports, or hobbies, Ted excelled. When his sister Sandy practiced piano, young Ted would listen once and reproduce the melodies perfectly. It was as if success was coded into his DNA. The family moved to Aurora, New York, when Ted was a teenager, where he quickly established himself as the golden boy of his high school. Popular, charismatic, and effortlessly intelligent, Ted seemed destined for greatness. At Bucknell University, Ted's leadership qualities flourished. He became student body president, played varsity lacrosse, and initially studied architecture before switching to economics, a decision that would shape his fortune. But perhaps Ted's most remarkable achievement came after graduation. He passed the New York bar exam without ever attending law school, studying entirely on his own. Think about that for a moment. The New York bar exam has a pass rate of around 60% for law school graduates. Ted Ammon, with nothing but textbooks and determination, conquered one of the most challenging legal examinations in the country. It was a feat that announced to the world, this man was different. The Wall Street warrior. Ted's career trajectory reads like a masterclass in American ambition. After joining Bank of America's executive training program, he quickly caught the attention of the financial world's biggest players. By 1984, he had landed at Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, one of the most powerful private equity firms of the decade. At the time, KKR was transforming into one of the most powerful private equity firms of the decade. And Ted's talent fit perfectly within its high-pressure environment. This was the era of greed is good, when Wall Street titans like Ted were reshaping American business through leveraged buyouts. Ted wasn't just along for the ride, he was driving. Among the monumental transactions he worked on was the $31 billion leverage buyout of Arjar Nabisco, a corporate battle that would later be immortalized in the best-selling book Barbarians at the Gate. Imagine the pressure. Billion-dollar deals where a single miscalculation could destroy companies and eliminate thousands of jobs. Ted thrived in this environment, his analytical mind dissecting complex financial structures while others struggled to keep pace. But Ted wasn't content to remain in someone else's shadow. After leaving KKR, he founded his own ventures, Big Flower Press, a successful printing company, and Chancery Lane Capital, a boutique private equity firm. By his 40s, Ted Ammon had amassed a fortune estimated between $30 and $100 million. The exact figure would later become a matter of deadly importance. The first Mrs. Ammon. Success in business didn't immediately translate to happiness in love. Ted's first marriage to Randy Day began with promise but crumbled under the weight of their ambitions. Both were climbing corporate ladders. Both were consumed by work, and slowly their marriage became more like a business partnership than a romance. The long hours, frequent travel, and relentless demands of their professional lives slowly eroded their bond. When Randy filed for divorce in 1983, Ted was devastated. He had hoped they could repair what they had built together, but Randy had already moved on emotionally. The divorce was civilized, as divorces among the wealthy often are, at least on the surface. Both parties had their own money, their own careers, their own paths forward. Ted threw himself back into work, but something was missing. Success without someone to share it with felt hollow. Little did Ted know that his greatest triumph and his greatest tragedy were both waiting for him in the form of a beautiful, ambitious woman named Jean Rosa. A troubled beginning. To understand what happened to Ted Ammon, you have to understand Jean Rosa. Born in California in 1956, she entered a world that seemed designed to break her spirit before it was fully formed. Her mother, Mary, was a mercurial figure. Family members suspected she suffered from bipolar disorder. Mary had grown up wealthy and religious, even briefly entering a convent, but abandoned the religious life for parties, men, and chaos. Jean Rosa was her last child. She never knew her biological father, an Italian sailor her mother had met at a party. Their affair lasted barely a week. Named after her absent father, Jean Rosa learned early that the people who were supposed to love you could disappear without warning. Mary continued to live freely, often bringing men into the home while paying little attention to her children. Some accounts even suggest troubling behavior from Mary's partners toward the children. When Jean Rosa was just 10 years old, her mother died of cancer, leaving her and her siblings to be shuffled between relatives. These early experiences forged Jean Rosa into someone who was simultaneously vulnerable and ruthless, someone who craved stability but had learned to survive chaos. Friends described her as intelligent, charming, and capable of incredible warmth, but also possessing a streak of cruelty that could emerge without warning. The fateful meeting. In 1984, Ted was apartment hunting in Manhattan when he missed a scheduled viewing due to work obligations. The next day, he called to apologize to the real estate agent, a young woman named Jean Rosa Rand. That rescheduled appointment changed both their lives forever. They went out for coffee after the viewing, and their connection was instant. Within a month, they had moved in together. Ted was captivated by Jean Rosa's artistic sensibility and her ability to transform any space into something beautiful. She had a gift for interior design that complemented his wealth perfectly. But Jean Rosa wanted more than cohabitation. After a year of living together, she issued an ultimatum: marriage or goodbye. Ted, still scarred from his first divorce, hesitated. Jean Rosa left him, and for a brief moment, it seemed their story was over. Then fate intervened. A month later, Ted saw Jean Rosa at an art museum with another man. The sight of her moving on triggered something primal in Ted. He realized he couldn't let her go. Within weeks, he had proposed. They married in 1986, beginning what would become one of the most toxic relationships in Hamptons history. Building the dream, hiding the nightmare. For the first few years, the Ammons seemed to have it all. Ted's business ventures were thriving, providing them with wealth that allowed for a lifestyle most people only see in movies. They lived in complete comfort, dividing their time between a Manhattan townhouse and their crown jewel, a spectacular East Hampton estate. The East Hampton house wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Situated on prime Hampton's real estate, the mansion boasted every luxury imaginable: multiple bedrooms, a swimming pool, perfectly manicured gardens, and the kind of security system that was supposed to make them untouchable. But behind the facade of domestic bliss, cracks were beginning to show. Jean Rosa could be quarrelsome, easily upset, and often difficult to appease. Ted's patience, which had seemed infinite during their courtship, began to wear thin under the constant emotional turbulence. The couple struggled with infertility for years, a challenge that intensified Jean Rosa's already fragile emotional state. In 1992, they chose another path: adoption. They traveled to Ukraine and adopted 2-year-old twins, a boy named Greg and a girl named Alexa. Greg and Alexa brought joy to the Ammon household, but they also highlighted the growing differences between Ted and Jean Rosa as parents. Ted was patient, nurturing, and consistent. Jean Rosa was loving but volatile, her mood swings becoming more pronounced as the stress of parenting combined with her existing psychological challenges. The marriage unravels. Jean Rosa's emotions frequently veered toward malicious or sarcastic behavior, and she often taunted Ted by comparing him to men even wealthier than he was. Imagine coming home after closing $1 million deal only to be told you're not as successful as some other businessman your wife has read about in the society pages. Her jealousy was another issue that plagued their marriage. She monitored her husband's movements obsessively, reading his correspondence, checking his phone, and confronting him if she suspected even the smallest sign of infidelity. Ted suggested marital counseling, but Jean Rosa refused. In her mind, the problems in their marriage were Ted's fault, not hers. This attitude would prove to be a consistent pattern throughout their relationship. Jean Rosa was never responsible for anything that went wrong. By the late 1990s, friends noticed that Ted seemed exhausted by his own life. The man who had conquered Wall Street was being slowly destroyed by his own wife's psychological warfare. By the late 1990s, Ted began opening up to friends and family about divorce. The decision to leave wasn't easy. Ted loved his children desperately and knew that divorce would limit his time with them. He also understood that Jean Rosa wouldn't make the process simple. She never made anything simple. In 2000, while renovating a Manhattan townhouse that Ted had purchased for her, Jean Rosa met a man who would ultimately orchestrate her husband's death. Daniel Pelosi was 38 years old, 7 years younger than Jean Rosa, and worked as an electrician and handyman, though he wasn't actually licensed as an electrician. By the time he entered Jean Rosa's life, Daniel already carried a troubled history. He had prior assault convictions, was caught stealing electricity worth $43,000 from the Long Island Power Authority, and faced multiple harassment and menacing allegations. Think about that for a moment. Daniel Pelosi had literally stolen electricity, not exactly the kind of person you'd expect to find in Jean Rosa's social circle. But Jean Rosa wasn't looking for someone from her social class. She was looking for someone who would be completely dependent on her, someone she could control in a way she had never been able to control Ted. He'd been arrested for drunk driving, struggled with alcohol and prescription drugs, and his addictions had shattered his first marriage. Daniel had 3 children from his previous marriage, mounting legal bills from his various arrests, and no legitimate path to the kind of wealth he craved. When he met Jean Rosa, Daniel saw opportunity. Here was a woman going through a bitter divorce from a multimillionaire, a woman who controlled access to more money than Daniel could earn in several lifetimes. All he had to do was make her dependent on him. The manipulation begins. Daniel Pelosi was a master manipulator, the kind of person who could identify someone's psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. He recognized that Jean Rosa's primary weakness was her need to feel desired and valued, something her marriage to Ted had stopped providing years earlier. Jean Rosa knew Ted despised him, and that almost seemed to fuel her determination. She flaunted the relationship, perhaps hoping to make Ted jealous. But Ted's reaction wasn't jealousy, it was horror. Ted saw Daniel for exactly what he was, a dangerous parasite who was now living in a house Ted owned, driving a car Ted paid for, and spending time with Ted's children. For Ted, it wasn't just jealousy. He saw Pelosi as a dangerous presence around his children, and Ted's instincts were correct. During this period, Daniel was facing multiple criminal charges, struggling with substance abuse, and demonstrating the kind of violent tendencies that would eventually explode into murder. Ted tried to reason with Jean Rosa, but she wouldn't hear it. To the twins, Daniel was tolerable, even likable, though their mother's manipulation increasingly widened the rift between them and their father. Jean Rosa began poisoning Greg and Alexa against their father, telling them that Ted didn't really love them, that he was trying to take their mother away from them, that Daniel was more of a father figure than Ted had ever been. It was psychological abuse disguised as maternal protection. The financial war. Ted turned to the only weapon he had, money. He withheld child support, reversed earlier property arrangements, and revealed that his true net worth was closer to $30 million, not the $100 million or even $300 million that Jean Rosa had claimed. This revelation infuriated Jean Rosa. She had been spending money as if Ted's fortune was infinite, and suddenly she was being told that her lifestyle wasn't sustainable. More importantly, if Ted's net worth was only $30 million instead of $100 million, her divorce settlement would be significantly smaller. Still, her expectations were relentless. She demanded that Ted cover not only child support, but every expense tied to the children, private schooling, household bills, even a nanny. Meanwhile, Daniel was encouraging Jean Rosa's most destructive impulses. He convinced her that Ted was hiding assets, that he was lying about his net worth, that she deserved everything and shouldn't settle for anything less than total victory. Daniel had a vested interest in maximizing Generosa's settlement. The more money she received, the more he would have access to. But Daniel was also planting darker seeds. According to later testimony, he began suggesting that there were other solutions to the Ted problem. Solutions that didn't involve lawyers or judges or lengthy court battles. The divorce from hell. The legal battle quickly became bitter. Generosa returned to New York with the children, and the couple began living separately. What should have been a straightforward division of assets became a war of attrition, with both sides spending enormous sums on legal fees while their relationship deteriorated into something truly toxic. Reports later suggested that during this time, she manipulated the twins against their father, making visitation increasingly difficult. Ted would arrive to pick up Greg and Alexa only to find that they had been turned against him, told lies about his motives and his love for them. Imagine the heartbreak. Ted had adopted these children as toddlers, raised them as his own, provided them with every advantage money could buy, and now his own wife was systematically destroying their relationship with him. By the time the divorce settlement was drafted, she stood to receive between $20 and $25 million along with $21,000 a month in child support. Yet even then, she was dissatisfied. But the money wasn't really the point anymore. Generosa wanted to destroy Ted completely, to make him pay not just financially, but emotionally for daring to leave her. And Daniel was more than happy to help her find ways to make that happen. By October 2001, the divorce was nearly finalized. Ted thought the worst was behind him. He had no idea that the worst was just beginning. Saturday, October 20th, 2001, should have been a quiet weekend in East Hampton. Ted had driven out to his mansion at 59 Middle Lane to spend some time alone, to decompress from the stress of the ongoing divorce proceedings, and to prepare for what he hoped would be a fresh start. Ted's routine was predictable, perhaps fatally so. He typically spent weekends alone at the East Hampton house, preferring the peace of the countryside to the chaos of Manhattan. The house's alarm system was sophisticated but, like many wealthy homeowners, Ted often left it disarmed when he was home. What Ted didn't know was that his movements were being watched, his routines cataloged, his vulnerabilities assessed. Parino confessed to driving with Pelosi to the East Hampton home the night of the murder and told prosecutors he saw Pelosi exit the house with blood on his clothes. According to later testimony, Christopher Parino, a laborer who worked for Daniel Pelosi, drove with Daniel to the Hamptons that night. The official story was that they were going to confront Ted about the divorce, but the evidence suggests something far more sinister was planned. The murder, around 2 a.m., as it was pieced together in a trial 3 years later, a man named Daniel Pelosi came into the house, went up to the bedroom and beat Mr. Ammon to death. Ted was asleep in his own bed when the attack began. Investigators identified at least 30 wounds on his head, with bruises and fractures caused by a blunt object, and that he had been incapacitated by a stun gun before the fatal blows were struck. Let me paint the horrific picture that forensic investigators pieced together. Ted was first incapacitated with a stun gun, a device that would have left him conscious but unable to move or defend himself. Then, while he was helpless, his attacker began the savage beating that would ultimately kill him. 30 wounds to the head. Think about that level of violence, that level of rage. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was execution, carried out with methodical brutality by someone who wanted Ted to suffer. Investment banker Ted Ammon, 52, was found bludgeoned to death in October 2001 in the East Hampton mansion he once shared with his estranged wife Generosa and their adopted twins. The attack was so savage that investigators initially suspected multiple perpetrators. How could one person inflict that much damage? But the evidence pointed to a single attacker, someone strong enough to overpower a grown man, someone filled with enough hatred to continue beating Ted long after he was dead. The discovery. His body was not found until Monday afternoon when a business associate of Mr. Ammon, Mark Angelson, became alarmed that Ted had missed their scheduled conference call with London investors. Mark Angelson's discovery of Ted's body was traumatic beyond imagination. Walking through the mansion, calling Ted's name, only to find his friend and business partner naked and bloodied in the master bedroom. The scene was so horrific that Angelson initially couldn't process what he was seeing. The mansion showed no signs of forced entry. The sophisticated alarm system had been disarmed. Valuable items throughout the house, artwork, jewelry, electronics, were untouched. This wasn't a burglary. This was personal. When police arrived, they found a crime scene that pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of Ted's routines and access to his home. The killer knew when Ted would be alone, knew how to disable the security system, and knew exactly where to find him. The immediate aftermath. The investigation began immediately. Jean Rosa inherited his $97 million fortune, and just 3 months later, she married Daniel Pelosi. 3 months. Ted's body was barely cold in the ground when the woman who had promised to love him till death do us part was walking down the aisle with another man. The timing wasn't just suspicious, it was obscene. But Jean Rosa didn't seem concerned about appearances. In her mind, she had won the ultimate victory. Ted was gone. She had inherited his fortune, and she could finally live the life she felt she deserved with the man who had helped make it all possible. Suspicion turned toward her at once. She had motive, and witnesses recalled her openly saying Ted deserved to die. Friends and family members came forward with disturbing stories about Generosa's escalating threats against Ted in the months leading up to his death. She had allegedly told people that Ted would be sorry for trying to leave her, that he would pay for putting her through the humiliation of divorce proceedings, that he deserved whatever happened to him. At the time, most people assumed these were just the bitter words of an angry ex-wife. Now they sounded like confessions. The star witness. The case against Daniel Pelosi might have remained unsolved if not for Christopher Perino, the laborer who made one of the most damaging admissions in recent criminal history. About to face trial for his possible involvement in the murder, Pelosi's buddy, Chris Perino, testified on Monday that he drove with Pelosi to Ted Ammon's home the night of the murder. According to Perino's testimony, Daniel emerged from the house in the early morning hours, covered in blood, and muttered the words that would seal his fate. "I think he's dead." But Perino's testimony went beyond just witnessing the aftermath. He claimed that Jean Rosa had actively encouraged the murder, offering money to have Ted beaten up, or worse. Construction workers claimed Jean Rosa had offered $50,000 to have Ted beaten. The picture that emerged from Perino's testimony was chilling. A conspiracy between a desperate woman and her violent lover to eliminate the man standing between them and a multi-million-dollar inheritance. The contradictory stories. Daniel Pelosi's own statements created a web of contradictions that prosecutors systematically destroyed during his trial. Initially, he denied being anywhere near East Hampton the night of the murder. When that story fell apart, he admitted being there but claimed he never entered the house. When physical evidence contradicted that version, Daniel finally admitted entering the mansion but claimed he found Ted already dead. In his final version of events, Daniel suggested that Jean Rosa herself had killed Ted and that he was being framed for a crime he didn't commit. Instead, he shifted blame onto Jean Rosa, claiming she had orchestrated everything. But this desperate attempt to save himself only reinforced the prosecution's theory that the murder was indeed a conspiracy between Jean Rosa and Daniel. Meanwhile, Jean Rosa maintained her innocence while simultaneously displaying behavior that struck observers as bizarre. She later accused Ted of indirectly causing her illness, claiming he had been told by her doctor about a lump in her breast years earlier, but never informed her. Even in death, Jean Rosa was blaming Ted for her problems. The woman who had orchestrated his murder was now claiming that he had tried to kill her by withholding medical information. It was narcissism taken to its logical extreme. The trial and conviction. Daniel Pelosi's trial became a media sensation, attracting coverage from around the world. The Hamptons murder had everything journalists love: wealth, sex, betrayal, and violence among America's elite. Jurors said they believed Pelosi's girlfriend, Tracy Riebenfeld. She had testified that Pelosi told her that 3 people were all with him at the murder: his pal, Christopher Perino, his nephew, Jeff Lookert, and Ammon's wife, Jean Rosa. The testimony painted a picture of a murder that involved multiple people, all orchestrated by Generosa's desire for revenge and money. The jury heard story after story of Daniel bragging about killing Ted, of Jean Rosa offering money for violence, of a conspiracy that had been months in the making. On January 25, 2005, Daniel Pelosi was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The conviction brought some measure of justice for Ted Ammon, but it came too late for the woman who had orchestrated his death. Generosa's final act. Jean Rosa was never formally charged. She died 2 years before Daniel's sentencing. In a final act of selfishness, she had denied the justice system and Ted's family the satisfaction of seeing her prosecuted for her crimes. She died on May 20th, 2003 at her East Hampton home, the same house where Ted had been murdered. Even in her final days, Jean Rosa maintained that she was the victim, that Ted had somehow deserved what happened to him, that she was blameless in his death. Before her death, Jean Rosa had turned on Daniel. Though they had married in January 2002, his reckless spending disgusted her. By July 2003, she forced him to sign a post-nuptial agreement, granting him $2 million in exchange for not contesting her will. In the end, Jean Rosa got exactly what she had always wanted: control. She controlled Ted's life through their marriage. She controlled his death through murder, and she controlled the aftermath by dying before she could be held accountable. The children's tragedy. Custody of Greg and Alexa was awarded to Ted's sister, Sandra Williams. In her words, she could provide the loving, stable home her brother would have wanted for his children. The twins, who had lost their adoptive father to murder and their adoptive mother to disease, now faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives with relatives who loved them but couldn't erase the trauma they had experienced. Years later, in 2012, Greg and Alexa, by then young adults, co-produced a documentary titled 59, Middle Lane, named after the East Hampton house where their father was killed. The documentary was their attempt to understand their past, to separate the truth from the lies their mother had told them, and to honor their father's memory. They speak of their father with warmth, describing him as kind, generous, and the steady anchor of their childhood. Their memories of their mother are more complicated. A mix of admiration for her intelligence and charisma and recognition of the chaos and destruction she brought when Daniel Pelosi entered their lives. The ultimate price. Ted Ammon's murder stands as a stark reminder that wealth cannot protect you from the people closest to you. All his success, all his money, all his careful planning couldn't save him from a woman who claimed to love him and a man who saw him only as an obstacle to wealth. The case also highlights the devastating impact of domestic manipulation and psychological abuse. Ted was slowly isolated from his children, systematically undermined by his wife, and ultimately murdered by the very person he had trusted with his fortune and his family. In the end, Ted Ammon's life was cut short not by a stranger or a random act of violence, but by greed, jealousy, and the toxic combination of a narcissistic woman and a violent man who saw murder as the solution to their problems. Today, Daniel Pelosi remains in prison, serving his sentence for a crime that shocked even seasoned investigators with its brutality. The East Hampton mansion where Ted died was eventually sold, but the memory of what happened there serves as a chilling reminder that in America's wealthiest enclaves, evil can wear a beautiful face and strike from within the very heart of what should be a loving home. Ted Ammon deserved better. His children deserved better. And his story serves as a warning that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sleeping next to you.